I've been judging sheep for 15 years, but nothing prepared me for what happened in Scottsdale. My name's Callie Flores, and I'm what you'd call an expert in the wool industry. One look at a sheep and I can tell you its breed, wool quality, and market value faster than most people can order coffee. The autumn air in Arizona hit different that year, crisp but with an underlying warmth that seemed to whisper promises. My blonde hair whipped around my face as I stepped out of the rental car, surveying the fairgrounds where the annual Scottsdale Wool Festival was being set up. "Miss Flores, thank God you're here." Tom Whitaker, the festival coordinator, rushed over. "We've got 20 more entries than expected." I adjusted my sunglasses, hiding my tired blue eyes. "Don't worry, Tom. I've judged larger competitions in worse conditions." The festival wouldn't open to the public for 2 days, giving me time to settle in and review the competition guidelines. This year featured a special showcase on innovative textile arts, my favorite category. My hotel room overlooked the desert landscape, mountains cutting a jagged line against the horizon. I unpacked methodically, hanging my judging blazers and arranging my reference books. Years of traveling had made me efficient, if not somewhat lonely. That evening, I headed to the community center near the fairgrounds. I'd signed up months ago to volunteer at the local soup kitchen during my stay, something I did in every city I visited. Work filled my days, but these moments of connection kept me human. First-time volunteer. A woman with striking red hair tied back in a practical knot handed me an apron. Her green eyes seemed to evaluate me with the same precision I used on merino wool. "In Scottsdale? Yes. I'm Callie." I extended my hand, noticing the calluses on hers when we shook, working hands, artists' hands. "Daphne Wood," she replied. "I run the textile booth at the festival. You must be the famous judge everyone's talking about." I felt my cheeks warm. "Hardly famous, just experienced." She guided me to a station where we were prepping vegetables. "Around here you might as well be a celebrity. The artisans have been working extra hours since they heard you were judging." We fell into an easy rhythm, chopping carrots and potatoes for the evening stew. Daphne told me about the local homeless population, how many were veterans, how the seasonal temperature shifts affected their numbers. "You seem to know everyone's story," I remarked as we moved to stirring massive pots. "Wool connects people," she said simply. "I collect their stories while collecting their needs. Some need blankets, some need purpose. I try to provide both." When we served the food, I watched her interact with each person, a touch on the shoulder here, a remembered name there. There was something magnetic about her presence that made me painfully aware of how I'd been living my life in hotel rooms and exhibition halls. Near the end of the evening, we reached for the same ladle, our hands colliding over a pot of soup. Something electric passed between us. Recognition, perhaps, or possibility. "Sorry," we both said simultaneously, then laughed. "You've got good technique," she said, nodding at the perfectly portioned bowls I'd been serving. "Ever considered a career change? From sheep judge to soup ladler? My mother would be thrilled." Her laughter was warm and genuine. "I meant you have an eye for detail. I'd love to show you my workshop sometime. Get a professional opinion before the judging begins." I knew I should maintain that professional distance, but something about the way the kitchen lights caught the copper strands in her hair made me reckless. "I'd like that," I said instead. "After hours, of course." As we cleaned up, our conversation drifted from wool techniques to travel stories to favorite books. By the time we walked out into the cool desert night, I felt as though I'd known Daphne Wood for years instead of hours. "See you at the festival," she said, keys jingling in her hand. "Or sooner, if you get tired of hotel food." I watched her drive away, suddenly aware that my stay in Scottsdale might become complicated in ways my judging manual hadn't prepared me for. 2 days into judging, and I already had a problem on my hands. 5 feet 8 inches of red-haired problem named Daphne Wood. I stood in front of her exhibition booth, clipboard in hand, struggling to focus on the technical aspects of her work instead of how the morning light played across her features. "This tapestry depicts the Sonoran Desert through seasons," Daphne explained, gesturing to an intricate wall hanging that seemed to capture the very essence of the landscape outside. "I've incorporated 7 natural dyes from local plants." I leaned closer, examining the tight, even weave. "Your tension control is remarkable," I said professionally, though what I really wanted to comment on was how her eyes matched the green threads running through the piece. "Would you like to see my technique demonstration later?" she asked, and I heard a hint of something personal beneath the professional invitation. I made a non-committal note on my clipboard. I should observe all the technical demonstrations equally. Of course, she nodded, but her smile suggested she saw right through my professional facade. Moving on to the next booth felt like walking through molasses. Every artist deserved my full attention, but my thoughts kept drifting back to those green eyes. That afternoon, she found me in the judge's break room, 2 coffees in hand. "Peace offering," she said, sliding one toward me. "I realized I might have put you in an awkward position." I accepted the coffee gratefully. The judging schedule was grueling. "It's fine, I just need to maintain objectivity." "Objectivity is overrated," she said with a mischievous smile. "But professionalism isn't. How about we discuss wool techniques as colleagues? No competition talk." We settled at a corner table, and what was meant to be a quick coffee break turned into an hour-long conversation about everything from ancient spinning methods to the environmental impact of modern dyes. Daphne's knowledge ran deep, her passion infectious. Outside, autumn leaves swirled past the window, occasional bursts of color against the desert backdrop. "Most people's eyes glaze over when I talk about wool microstructure," she laughed. "I'm not most people," I replied. "I spent my childhood summers on my grandparents' sheep farm in Montana. Wool's in my blood." "Mine too," she said softly. Our eyes locked for a moment longer than was strictly professional. The door banged open, breaking the spell. Meredith Vaughn, another contestant, walked in and stopped short at the sight of us. "Judge Flores," she said, voice dripping with sweetness while her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Getting to know the competition?" "Just discussing historical dyeing techniques," I said, straightening my posture. "How fascinating," Meredith replied. "Though I wonder if all contestants will get such personal attention?" The implication hung in the air. Daphne stood, gathering her empty cup. "I should get back to my booth. Thanks for the wool terminology clarification, Judge Flores." After she left, Meredith lingered, arms crossed. "You know her work is the front-runner in 3 categories." "I haven't made any decisions yet," I said stiffly, though Daphne's tapestry had indeed impressed me on technical merit alone. "Maybe you should consider recusing yourself from judging her categories," Meredith suggested. "People are talking." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Anger, not embarrassment. "My judging is based solely on technical execution and artistic merit. Now, if you'll excuse me." That evening, I paced my hotel room, Meredith's insinuations eating at me. My professional reputation was beyond reproach. I'd never let personal feelings influence my judging. But were there feelings to worry about? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "If you're hiding from festival politics, there's a great taco place 10 minutes from your hotel. Neutral territory. D." I stared at the message, debating. The professional choice would be to decline. Instead, I found myself typing, "Address? I'm starving." The restaurant was a tiny hole-in-the-wall place with the best fish tacos I'd ever tasted. Daphne wore her hair down, revealing copper waves that caught the hanging lights. "I'm sorry about Meredith," she said after we ordered. "She's been trying to win the innovation category for years." "It's not your fault," I sighed. "But she's right that I need to be careful about appearances." Daphne nodded. "I understand. She hesitated. "I haven't connected with someone like this in a long time." Neither had I, but admitting it felt dangerous. Instead, I steered us to safer topics. Her teaching at the community college, my travels judging competitions across the country. As we walked to our cars after dinner, she said, "There's an auction tomorrow night for the homeless shelter. Come as a guest, not a judge." "I shouldn't," I replied, even as I wanted to. "All work and no play makes Callie a dull judge," she teased. Under the stars, with the scent of desert sage in the air, my resolve weakened. Maybe just for an hour. Her smile was worth the risk. As I drove back to my hotel, I told myself it was just dinner between colleagues. But the warmth spreading through my chest suggested something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to judge just yet. "It's just a hike, Callie, not a date," I muttered to myself as I laced up my boots. The festival had organized a desert nature walk for participants and judges to inspire natural textile designs, according to the brochure. I told myself I was going for professional reasons, not because I knew Daphne would be there. The morning air still held desert coolness when our group gathered at the trailhead. Daphne arrived wearing a wide-brimmed hat, her red hair gathered in a loose braid. She spotted me and waved, that now familiar smile sending a flutter through my chest. "Judge Flores in hiking boots," she said, approaching. "I wasn't sure if you owned anything besides those professional flats." "There's a lot you don't know about me," I replied, immediately regretting how flirtatious it sounded. Our guide, a weathered man named Ray, led about 15 of us onto a trail that wound through saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings. He stopped periodically to identify plants or explain geological features. I noticed how Daphne asked insightful questions, scribbling notes in a small sketchbook. "Gathering inspiration?" I asked during one stop. "Always," she nodded. "Nature creates the best color palettes." Somehow, we ended up at the back of the group. When Ray led everyone around a bend to examine a particular rock formation, Daphne touched my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a small flowering cactus hidden in the shade. "Piniocereus gregi, night-blooming cereus. They're incredibly rare to see in bloom." I knelt beside her to examine the delicate white flower. "It's beautiful. They only bloom for one night each year. By this afternoon it'll be gone." Something about the ephemeral nature of the bloom made me acutely aware of the moment, the heat beginning to rise from the desert floor, the scent of creosote in the air, and Daphne's shoulder brushing against mine. When we looked up, the group had disappeared around the bend. "Damn," I said. "We lost them." Daphne shrugged. "Ray's taking them on the tourist trail. I know a more interesting way back. If you trust me?" I hesitated only briefly. "Lead on." Her more interesting path took us higher into the hills, through stretches where the trail almost disappeared. As we walked, Daphne pointed out plants used in traditional dyeing. "This creosote bush creates a gorgeous yellow gold," she explained, breaking off a small twig. "Here, smell it." I leaned in as she held it to my nose, our faces suddenly close. The plant had a sharp, resinous scent that reminded me of rain. "And this," she continued, moving to a bushy plant with tiny leaves, "is what gives my desert sunset series that vibrant orange undertone." She guided my fingers to crush some of the leaves, her hand lingering over mine. The simple touch sent electricity through my arm. "You really know your stuff," I said, my voice embarrassingly breathy. 15 years of experimentation." Her eyes met mine. "I believe in learning by touching, feeling, experiencing." We continued walking, the conversation flowing easily between technical wool talk and personal stories. I told her about my first sheep judging competition at 16, how I'd fallen in love with the precision and tradition of it. She shared how she discovered weaving during a difficult period after college. "Creating something beautiful from raw fiber. It healed me," she said simply. The sky darkened suddenly, unusual for morning. We looked up to see heavy clouds gathering overhead. "That's not good," Daphne frowned. "Flash floods are no joke out here." As if on cue, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly increasing in intensity. The desert, which moments ago had been bone dry, suddenly came alive with rivulets of water streaming down every surface. "There's a cave outcropping up ahead," Daphne shouted over the increasingly heavy rain, grabbing my hand. "Come on." We ran, slipping occasionally on the suddenly slick ground, until we reached a shallow cave in the rocky hillside. It wasn't deep, but the overhang provided shelter from the downpour that had become a proper desert cloudburst. "So much for desert dryness," I laughed, pushing my soaked blonde hair from my face. Daphne was equally drenched, her thin hiking shirt clinging to her body. The cave was small enough that we stood close, our shoulders touching as we watched the rain create a curtain at the cave's mouth. "We should get out of these wet shirts," she said practically. "Body heat dries faster than air in this humidity." She was right, of course, but something about peeling off layers in this intimate space made my heart race. I turned away slightly as we both removed our outer shirts, leaving just thin tanks underneath. "Desert storms never last long," she said, wringing water from her braid. In the dim light of the cave, with rain drumming outside and Daphne so close I could see water droplets clinging to her eyelashes, something shifted between us. The professional boundaries I'd been clinging to seemed absurdly irrelevant. She must have felt it too, because she reached out slowly, giving me every chance to pull away, and tucked a wet strand of hair behind my ear. "Callie," she whispered, her fingers lingering against my cheek. I knew I should step back, maintain that professional distance. Instead, I found myself leaning forward, drawn by something more powerful than career concerns. Just as our lips were about to meet, thunder crashed directly overhead, making us both jump and then laugh nervously at our startled reactions. The moment passed, but something had changed. As we waited for the rain to subside, standing side by side watching the desert transform under the deluge, I knew that whatever was happening between us wasn't going away when the clouds cleared. When I returned to the festival grounds the next day, my phone buzzed with a text from the committee chair requesting an urgent meeting. The conference room felt uncomfortably warm as I faced 5 stern-faced board members. "Judge Flores," Director Hammond began, his fingers forming a steeple. "We've received concerns about your objectivity regarding certain contestants." My stomach dropped. "I assure you my judging remains completely impartial." "You were seen hiking alone with Daphne Wood yesterday," said Barbara Winters, her penciled eyebrows arched high. "And having dinner with her the night before." "We got separated from the group briefly," I explained, hating how defensive I sounded. "And dinner was just colleagues discussing textile history." Hammond slid a folder across the table. "We value your expertise, Callie. That's why we brought you here. But the festival's reputation depends on fairness, real and perceived." I flipped through the folder, pictures of Daphne and me at the restaurant, at the hiking trail. Nothing incriminating, but enough to create whispers. "We're not asking you to stop these friendships," Hammond said carefully. "But perhaps maintain some professional distance until after the competition?" I nodded stiffly, humiliation burning my cheeks. 15 years building my reputation, and now this. As I walked across the festival grounds afterward, I felt eyes following me, wondered whose phone had captured those images. Near the artisan booths, I spotted Daphne demonstrating a weaving technique to an enraptured audience. She looked up, caught my eye, and smiled warmly. I returned a brief professional nod and walked away quickly. For 3 days I maintained my distance. I judged her work with the same critical eye I applied to all entries, though I couldn't deny her technical skill was exceptional. When our paths crossed, I kept interactions brief and formal. I told myself it was professional integrity, not fear, driving my actions. At night in my hotel room, I drafted my resignation letter from next year's judging panel. Maybe it was time to retire from the circuit anyway. The thought brought more relief than regret. On the 4th night, my phone lit up with a message from Daphne. "Everything okay? You seem distant." I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed, "Committee concerns about impartiality. Need to keep professional boundaries until after competition." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Finally, understood. "Good luck with judging. I respect your integrity." No anger, no guilt-tripping, just acceptance that made my chest ache with what-ifs. The next morning brought the advanced textile category, Daphne's strongest entry. Her intricate wall hanging depicting desert life cycles through natural dyes and innovative structural techniques was objectively masterful. Even Meredith Vaughn, standing beside me, gave a grudging, "She's good, I'll give her that." When I presented my scoring to the committee, I'd been meticulously fair. Perhaps too fair, scoring Daphne's work slightly lower than it deserved out of fear of showing bias. That evening, the charity auction for the homeless shelter was held in the festival's main pavilion. I'd planned to skip it, but Hammond himself encouraged all judges to attend, reminding us it was for a good cause. I wore my most professional black dress and hovered near the refreshment table, making polite conversation while avoiding the section where Daphne's donated wall hanging was displayed. "Next item," the auctioneer announced, "a small but exquisite piece called Desert Whispers by Daphne Wood, starting bid $200. Despite myself, I looked. It was a tiny, perfect rendering of the night-blooming Sirius we'd seen on our hike, captured in threads so fine they seemed to glow with their own light. "200, called a voice. "300, countered another. The bidding rose quickly to $800, then stalled. Without planning to, I raised my paddle. $1,200. A hush fell over the room. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $1,200 from Judge Flores. Do I hear 13? No one countered. Sold to Judge Flores for $1,200, he announced, sounding bewildered. As I arranged payment, avoiding eye contact with anyone, I felt a presence beside me. That's a lot for such a small piece, Daphne said quietly. I kept my eyes on the payment form. It's for charity. Is that the only reason? Her voice was gentle, not pushing. I finally looked up, meeting those green eyes that had haunted my dreams. It reminded me of something rare and beautiful, something that might be gone if I waited too long. Her breath caught audibly. Before she could respond, I handed over my credit card to the cashier. Thank you for your generous donation, Judge Flores, the shelter director said, handing me the small framed textile. This will provide meals for months. As I accepted the piece, a small note fluttered from behind the frame. I caught it discreetly, unfolding it later in a quiet corner. Some flowers bloom just once, but their seeds remain, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. D. I traced my finger over the stitched flower in the frame, remembering what she'd said about its ephemeral bloom. Looking across the room, I found her watching me, a question in her eyes that had nothing to do with textiles or competitions. For the first time in days, I smiled at her, a real smile, not a professional mask. Whatever happened after the festival ended, I knew one thing with certainty: some boundaries were worth crossing. Committee concerns be damned. The penultimate day of the festival dawned with a buzz of excitement. The finals for each category would be announced by evening, and the exhibition hall hummed with nervous energy. My judging duties were nearly complete, each score carefully recorded and submitted to the committee. All that remained was the opening ceremony for the final exhibition, where contestants would display their masterpieces together before winners were announced tomorrow. I stood at the edge of the stage in my official capacity, watching artisans arrange their works. Daphne was positioning her showcase piece, a large tapestry depicting desert life through seasons, its colors shifting subtly from section to section. Since the auction, we'd maintained a careful public distance, but the air between us crackled with unspoken possibilities whenever our eyes met. 2-minute warning, called the stage manager, and I watched as Daphne reached for her collar, fingers searching for something that wasn't there. Her face transformed instantly, panic replacing concentration. She patted her neck, checked her pockets, then dropped to her knees to search the floor around her display. I couldn't maintain my distance seeing her distress. Daphne, what's wrong? My pendant, she whispered, voice tight. My grandmother's loom pendant. I always wear it for exhibitions. It's gone. The small silver pendant was more than jewelry. I'd seen her touch it like a talisman throughout the festival, a ritual before she began any demonstration. When did you last have it? I asked, professional distance forgotten. This morning, definitely. I checked it before leaving my hotel. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued searching. It's been in my family for generations. Every wool worker in my family has worn it. The ceremony was starting, but Daphne looked ready to tear the building apart. I made a quick decision. Go take your place. I'll organize a search. She hesitated, eyes bright with unshed tears. It's just a trinket to anyone else but to me. I understand, I said softly. I'll find it. As the ceremony began, I slipped away, recruiting volunteers from the festival staff. We retraced Daphne's steps through the exhibition hall, checked the restrooms, the cafeteria, nothing. By the time the ceremony ended, we'd expanded the search to the entire festival grounds. Daphne joined us, her professional demeanor cracking slightly around the edges. It was my grandmother's, and her grandmother's before that, she explained as we walked the perimeter. The pendant has a tiny loom, etched into the silver with actual gold thread woven through it. We'll find it, I assured her, though the festival grounds covered acres, and the tiny pendant could be anywhere. As afternoon faded to evening with no success, Daphne's shoulders slumped. Maybe it's a sign, she said quietly as we stood alone near the exhibition entrance. My grandmother always said our family's fortunes were tied to that pendant. I don't believe in signs, I replied firmly. But I do believe in thoroughness. We haven't checked the administration building yet. The building was mostly empty, festival staff having left for dinner. We searched the main office, finding nothing. Then I remembered the records room. Daphne had been there yesterday, checking on previous winners for research. The records room was dusty, filled with filing cabinets and boxes of festival history dating back decades. We began methodically checking tables and floors, moving boxes to look underneath. This feels like a needle in a haystack, Daphne sighed after 30 minutes of searching. Speaking of haystacks, I said, pointing to a box labeled Historical Photographs 1990 to 2000s. Didn't you mention your grandmother exhibited here years ago? Curiosity momentarily replaced worry on Daphne's face. Yes, she won the innovation category in '95. Why? Just finding distractions, I admitted, pulling the box down. Maybe looking at old photos will give us a mental break. We sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through plastic-protected photographs. Despite her concern, Daphne smiled at the dated fashions and familiar faces of wool artisans from the past. That's old Jim Robbins, she pointed. He still comes every year, though he stopped competing after his arthritis got bad. I turned another page, revealing a group photo from the 1998 festival. Is that your grandmother? I asked, pointing to a striking older woman with familiar red hair, wearing what looked like the missing pendant. Daphne leaned closer. Yes, good eye. Then she froze, staring at the photo. Wait, that woman next to her? I peered at the image. A younger woman with blonde hair stood beside Daphne's grandmother, both smiling widely, arms linked like old friends. That's my mother, I whispered, recognizing the face instantly despite her youth. Daphne's head snapped up. Your mother knew my grandmother? But that's impossible. She would have mentioned. I had no idea she was ever involved in textiles, I said, equally confused. She never mentioned your family. We stared at the photograph where our families stood together, clearly close. The festival around us seemed to fade away as we confronted this unexpected connection. There's more, Daphne said, flipping rapidly through the album now. Look, they're in almost every photo from '98. They won a joint award for collaborative weaving. The evidence was undeniable. My mother and her grandmother had not only known each other but had been creative partners. Yet in all my years in the wool industry, my mother had never once mentioned this connection. Why would they keep this secret? I wondered aloud. Daphne closed the album slowly. I don't know, but I intend to find out. We left the records room, the missing pendant temporarily forgotten in light of this discovery. Whatever connected our families in the past suddenly seemed more important than maintaining professional boundaries in the present. Back in my hotel room, I paced the floor, phone in hand. It was nearly midnight in Montana, but this couldn't wait. I pressed call. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. Callie, is everything all right? I need to ask you something, I said without preamble. Did you know a woman named Margaret Wood at the Scottsdale Festival about 20 years ago? The silence that followed told me everything. How did you find out about that? She finally asked, fully awake now. I just found photographs of you two together. You won an award together. I paused. Mom, I'm judging her granddaughter's work at the festival right now. Another long pause. Daphne, she said softly. Little Daphne with the fire-bright hair. Why didn't you ever tell me you were involved in textile arts, or that you knew this family? I heard rustling, as if she were sitting up in bed. It's complicated, Callie. Margaret and I were close once, very close. We developed a weaving technique together that combined her traditional methods with my innovations in dye setting. What happened? She sighed deeply. We had plans to start a business together. But then your father's company needed someone to develop specialized wool treatments. The money was better than anything we could make as independent artisans. That doesn't explain why you never mentioned her. I took our joint research with me, she admitted quietly. The formulas for the dye setting technique that made your father's textile company successful. They were based on work Margaret and I did together. The implications hit me hard. You stole her work? I didn't see it that way then, my mother defended. We'd created it together, but she saw it as betrayal. Did you at least compensate her? Another uncomfortable pause. Your father's lawyers handled it. She signed away rights for a settlement that seemed fair at the time, but the techniques we developed became the foundation of Flores Textiles, worth millions eventually. I sank onto the bed, stunned. Our family business, the company that had paid for my education, my comfortable upbringing, was built partially on stolen ideas. Does Daphne know about this? I doubt Margaret would have told her the details. It was painful for everyone. After ending the call, I sat in the dark hotel room, processing. Our families weren't strangers, they were estranged, built on a foundation of betrayal and broken trust. My phone buzzed with a text from Daphne. Any luck with the pendant? Also, my mother's on the phone asking strange questions about you. I replied, need to talk, can you come to my room? 20 minutes later, a soft knock came at my door. Daphne stood in the hallway, looking tired but determined. My mother just told me a very interesting story, she said, walking past me into the room. Apparently, your mother and my grandmother were quite the dynamic duo before your mom ran off with their shared research. I just heard the same basic story from my side, I admitted. Though my mother sees it differently. Of course she does, Daphne said sharply, then softened. Sorry, but that research launched your family business while my grandmother had to rebuild from scratch. I gestured for her to sit. I had no idea, Daphne. I wouldn't have hidden this connection if I'd known. She perched on the edge of the desk chair. I believe you. But it's strange, isn't it? Of all the wool judges in all the world, you walk into my festival. Despite the tension, I smiled at the reference. Hardly seems coincidental. My mother thinks your family arranged for you to judge here as some kind of power play. I laughed outright. Trust me, I tried to get out of this assignment. I hate the desert heat. Her lips quirked up. And yet, here we are. Here we are, I echoed softly. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air between us charged with the weight of our family's history and our own unresolved tension. Does it change things? I asked quietly. Learning about our families? Daphne considered this, her green eyes holding mine. It explains things, the pendant disappearing right before finals. My mother thinks it's some cosmic justice. You think my family had something to do with that? She shook her head. No. But it's strange timing. I moved to sit on the bed, closer to her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what my mother did. You weren't even born yet. Still. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing hers. I understand conflict of interest now. I should recuse myself from judging your category tomorrow. Don't, she said firmly. Win or lose, I want it fair. Her fingers intertwined with mine, and suddenly our family's ancient rivalry seemed distant compared to the immediate electricity of her touch. Daphne, I whispered. Her name a question and answer all at once. She moved from the chair to the edge of the bed beside me. We should probably talk more about this family drama. Probably, I agreed, but neither of us seemed interested in our mother's old wounds. When she leaned forward, I met her halfway. Her lips were soft against mine, tentative at first, then increasingly urgent. Years of professional restraint melted away as I pulled her closer, my hands tangling in her copper hair. This complicates everything, she murmured against my neck. I'm tired of playing it safe, I replied, guiding her back onto the hotel bed. What followed was the sweet discovery of another person, the curve of her waist under my palms, the soft sounds she made when I kissed that sensitive spot below her ear. We took our time learning each other, whispering questions and encouragements as clothes were slowly discarded. In the aftermath, lying tangled in hotel sheets with her head on my shoulder, the world outside seemed impossibly distant, judges and competitions. Family rivalries and missing pendants all faded compared to the simple reality of Daphne's heartbeat against mine. The morning of Judgment Day arrived with golden desert light streaming through curtains I'd forgotten to close. Daphne was already up, sitting cross-legged on the bed in my borrowed t-shirt, hair tousled from sleep. Morning, Judge, she said with a playful smile that made my heart flip. Having any thoughts about recusing yourself? I sat up, running a hand through my tangled blonde hair. After last night? Probably should. Too late now, she replied, leaning over to kiss me softly. Finals judging starts in 2 hours. Reality crashed back. The competition, our family's history, the professional lines I'd thoroughly crossed. Daphne, Don't overthink it, she interrupted. Whatever happens with the judging, this, she gestured between us, is separate. Easy to say, harder to believe. As she gathered her things to return to her own hotel room, I felt the weight of my position pressing down. I'd spent 15 years building my reputation as an impartial judge. One weekend with Daphne Wood had changed everything. When I arrived at the exhibition hall, Hammond pulled me aside. Final deliberations in 30 minutes. The wool tapestry category is particularly close. I nodded, my stomach churning. Daphne's piece was objectively exceptional, possibly the best technical work I'd seen in years, but could I separate that assessment from my feelings for its creator? At the judges' table, I presented my scores without commentary. When it was announced that Daphne's work had the highest technical marks from all judges, not just me, I felt both vindicated and exposed. Remarkable consensus, noted Hammond. Wood's tapestry techniques are innovative. James Stewart, another judge who'd been unusually quiet throughout the festival, cleared his throat. I wonder if we're all being objective enough. My head snapped up. Meaning? James gave me a knowing look. Just that certain judges seem particularly invested in certain contestants. If you have something to say, James, say it directly, I replied, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. I saw you leaving Wood's hotel room this morning, he said quietly, but loud enough for others to hear, wearing yesterday's clothes. The room fell silent. Hammond looked between us, his expression unreadable. My personal life is irrelevant to my judging, I said firmly. Is it? James pressed. The daughter of Elizabeth Flores getting involved with Margaret Wood's granddaughter right before final judging? Seems relevant to me. I froze. How do you know about that connection? This isn't my first festival, James replied. I was here 20 years ago when your mother took what didn't belong to her. Hammond raised his hands. That's ancient history. Let's focus on the present exhibition. It's not ancient history if it's repeating itself, James insisted. I move that Judge Flores be removed from final decisions regarding Daphne Wood's entries. The committee voted quickly, and it was decided I would be excluded from the tapestry category's final judgment. As I walked away from the table, humiliation burned through me. Not because of the exclusion, which was fair, but because James had weaponized my feelings for Daphne. Outside the hall, I texted her, "Need to talk. Meet me at the south entrance." She arrived looking concerned. What happened? James Stewart happened, I explained. He saw me leaving your room this morning. I've been removed from judging your category. Her face fell. I'm so sorry, Callie. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. It gets worse, I added. He knows about our family's history. Before she could respond, my phone buzzed Hammond, requesting my presence at an emergency meeting. I squeezed Daphne's hand quickly before hurrying back. The meeting was brief and devastating. We value your expertise, Hammond said, but this situation creates an appearance problem we can't ignore. I nodded, understanding the unspoken message. My judging career was essentially over. That evening, the festival grounds were illuminated with thousands of twinkling lights for the final celebration. I wandered through them alone, my official duties complete except for tomorrow's award ceremony. The desert night was cool, stars impossibly bright overhead. I found Daphne sitting on a bench near the outdoor exhibition, watching visitors admire the displays. The committee questioned every score I gave you, I said, sitting beside her. They found no bias, which almost disappointed them. Does it matter? She asked softly. My career as a judge probably ended today, I admitted. 20 years of work. She turned to face me fully. I never meant for this to happen. I know. I managed a small smile. Strangely, I'm not as upset as I should be. The festival lights created a magical atmosphere, transforming the ordinary grounds into something ethereal. Visitors moved between exhibits like ghosts, their voices a distant murmur. What now? Daphne asked as we walked slowly through the illuminated paths. I've been thinking about consulting work, I replied. Teaching, maybe. There's more to wool than judging competitions. We stopped in a quiet corner where desert plants cast fantastic shadows under colored lights. Around us, the festival continued, but in that moment, we existed in our own world. I've spent my whole life following rules, I said quietly, being the perfect judge, the perfect daughter, never stepping out of line. And now? Now I'm standing here with you, and I can't bring myself to regret it. She moved closer, her eyes reflecting the twinkling lights. Even with everything that's happened? Instead of answering, I leaned forward and kissed her, not the hesitant exploration of last night, but a deliberate choice, a public declaration. When we separated, her smile outshone all the festival lights combined. I'll take that as a no, she whispered against my lips. As we walked hand in hand through the desert night, careers and competition seemed distant compared to the possibility unfolding between us. Whatever James Stewart might say tomorrow no longer mattered. Some connections were worth the risk. I woke to the gentle ping of my phone. Daphne still slept beside me, her red hair spread across the pillow like copper threads. The message on my screen jolted me fully awake. Check outside your door, unknown number. Careful not to wake Daphne, I slipped on my robe and crept to the hotel room door. There on the hallway carpet lay the missing pendant, its silver gleaming in the dim light. Attached was a note in unfamiliar handwriting. Some things should remain buried. Withdraw your girlfriend's entry or the committee gets proof of your collaboration. J.S.? James Stewart. That bastard had taken the pendant. My hands shook with anger as I scooped up the necklace and note, closing the door silently behind me. Callie? Daphne's sleepy voice called from the bed. Everything okay? I turned, forcing a smile. More than okay. Look what I found. Her eyes widened as I held up the pendant. She leapt from bed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. My grandmother's pendant. Where was it? I hesitated, then showed her the note. Her face darkened as she read it. That manipulative little weasel, she spat. He stole it to pressure you? He must have taken it during the opening ceremony, I said. He was standing near your display. Daphne clutched the pendant, her knuckles whitening. What are we going to do? I paced the small hotel room. You're not withdrawing, that's not an option. But your reputation has already been questioned, I interrupted. But yours hasn't. Your work deserves recognition, Daphne. She fastened the pendant around her neck, fingers lingering on the tiny silver loom. We could just ignore him. Let him do his worst. I shook my head. He's clearly been nursing this grudge about our families for decades. He won't stop. We dressed quickly, the award ceremony just hours away. My mind raced through scenarios, each more problematic than the last. If James had evidence of our relationship photos, perhaps the committee would invalidate Daphne's entry regardless of its merit. I need to confront him, I finally said. Before the ceremony. I'm coming with you, Daphne insisted. We found James in the judges' lounge, smugly reviewing final score sheets. His expression faltered when he saw us together, then reformed into a condescending smile. Judge Flores, Miss Wood. Lovely morning, isn't it? I placed the note on the table between us. Care to explain this? He glanced at it dismissively. I have no idea what you're talking about. Cut the crap, James, I said, my voice low. You stole Daphne's pendant. Prove it, he replied, leaning back in his chair. Just like I can prove you two have been, collaborating throughout the competition. Why? Daphne asked. What do you gain from this? His smile thinned. Justice. Your grandmother cheated me 20 years ago, claimed my design technique as her own. Then Elizabeth Flores stole both our work. I blinked in surprise. You worked with them? I was Margaret's apprentice before your mother showed up, he said bitterly. When they formed their partnership, my contributions were forgotten. Then Elizabeth took everything. The pieces suddenly clicked. This isn't about Daphne's entry at all. This is your decades-old vendetta. The Wood women have been stealing recognition for generations, he hissed. Like grandmother, like granddaughter. Without warning, I pulled out my phone and hit play on the voice recorder app. James's confession played back clearly. Your grandmother cheated me 20 years ago. His face drained of color. You wouldn't. Try me, I replied coldly. I've already forwarded this to my email. Delete it if you want. The door opened behind us, and Hammond walked in with several committee members. They paused, sensing the tension. Everything all right here? Hammond asked. I looked directly at James, giving him one chance to back down. When he remained silent, I made my decision. Actually, no, I said, turning to the committee. I need to report judge misconduct. What followed was a blur of accusations, evidence, and testimonies. I played the recording. Daphne showed the note and pendant. James alternated between denial and justification, digging himself deeper with each word. By noon, James had been removed from the judging panel, his scores invalidated across all categories. The committee launched an investigation into his past judgments as well. We owe you an apology, Judge Flores, Hammond said afterward. Your relationship with Miss Wood still presents a conflict of interest, but there was clearly no attempt to manipulate scores. I nodded, understanding the unspoken message. My judging days might be over, but my reputation remained intact. As we left the administration building, Daphne squeezed my hand. That was incredibly brave. Or incredibly stupid, I replied. I just torpedoed any chance of continuing on the circuit. She stopped, turning me to face her. You chose integrity over career. That's never stupid. In the exhibition hall, artisans were making final adjustments to their displays before the awards ceremony. Daphne's tapestry hung prominently, its intricate patterns catching the light. Whatever happens with the awards, I said, your work speaks for itself. She smiled, touching the pendant at her throat. Some things are worth more than prizes. As we stood together amid the colorful tapestries and woven art, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The wool community had been my entire world for so long. Now, looking at Daphne, I understood there were other kinds of connections worth weaving. 6 months can change everything. The desert spring had arrived in Scottsdale, painting the landscape with wildflowers when I returned for the first time since the festival. My rental car felt familiar as I navigated the roads, no longer needing GPS to find my way. I'd traded my judge's clipboard for business cards reading, Callie Flores Consulting Textile Industry Expert. Turned out there was plenty of demand for my expertise outside the competition circuit. The morning air held that perfect desert crispness as I pulled into the driveway of a now familiar adobe house. Before I could grab my bag, the front door swung open and Daphne appeared on the porch, her red hair gleaming in the sunshine. You're early, she called, walking down to meet me. Couldn't wait, I admitted, pulling her into a kiss that still, after all these months, made my heart race. We'd done the impossible, maintained a long-distance relationship between Montana and Arizona, with weeks of video calls punctuated by precious in-person visits. Today marked a milestone, my first official consultation with the Scottsdale Art Institute, where Daphne taught textile arts. You ready for your big presentation? She asked, helping me with my bags. Ask me after coffee. Inside, Daphne's home studio was alive with color and texture. Her festival-winning tapestry hung on the living room wall, but newer works filled the space, including early samples from her sustainable wool fashion line that had launched last month to critical acclaim. The dean called again, she said, handing me coffee in a handmade mug. He's hoping you'll consider a more permanent position. I sipped slowly, savoring both the rich coffee and the moment. It's tempting. No pressure, she replied, though her eyes said otherwise. We both knew long distance had its limits. My phone buzzed. My mother calling again. She'd been relentless since learning about Daphne, alternating between guilt over the past and curiosity about my future. Still avoiding her? Daphne asked, noticing my hesitation. Just postponing an inevitable conversation. I sighed. She wants to meet you. Maybe it's time. Our mothers managed to reconnect. The world didn't end. That had been unexpected. After decades of silence, Elizabeth Flores and Diana Wood had begun a cautious reconciliation, prompted by their daughter's relationship, old wounds healing slowly but surely. Later that afternoon, I stood before faculty and students at the Institute, presenting my analysis of sustainable textile practices. As I spoke about tradition and innovation, my eyes kept finding Daphne in the audience, her proud smile giving me confidence. Afterward, as the desert sunset painted the world gold, we drove to a familiar spot in the mountains where we'd hiked during the festival. I spread a blanket while Daphne unpacked a picnic basket. Remember when we got caught in the rain here? She asked, pouring wine into plastic cups. How could I forget? It was the moment I knew I was in trouble. She laughed. What kind of trouble? The best kind. As we ate, I found myself unusually quiet, fingers repeatedly touching the small box in my pocket. You okay? Daphne asked. You seem distracted. I've been thinking, I began, about next steps. For the consultancy? For us. Her eyes widened slightly. I took a deep breath and pulled out the box, opening it to reveal a ring woven from fine silver threads. I'm not good with transitions, I said. I've spent my life judging things definitively. This works, this doesn't. And I know, with absolute certainty, that what we have works. Her hands covered her mouth, eyes bright with unshed tears. I designed this with a silversmith in Montana, I continued, voice steadier than I felt. Silver threads, like the ones in your grandmother's pendant. A continuous weave, no beginning or end. Callie, she whispered. I'm not asking you to answer right now, I said quickly. But I've been offered a permanent position at the Phoenix Textile Conservatory. If you want me to stay, to build something here with you. She didn't let me finish, pulling me into a kiss that answered more eloquently than words. Is that a yes? I asked when we finally separated. That's a hell yes, she laughed, tears spilling over. As I slipped the ring onto her finger, the sun dipped below the mountains, bathing us in that magical desert twilight. I never thought I'd thank a sheep competition for changing my life, I murmured against her hair. The following spring, we attended the festival together for the first time as a couple. I wore a consultant's badge instead of a judge's credentials, and Daphne entered a collaborative piece rather than competing solo. Standing before the exhibition hall, I felt a moment of nostalgia for my judging days, quickly replaced by satisfaction in my new role. Ready? Daphne asked, squeezing my hand. Actually, I'm a little nervous, I admitted. Everyone here knew me as Judge Flores. And now they'll know you as my fiancé, she said simply. The woman who chose love over scorecards. As we walked in together, I was surprised by the warm reception, handshakes, and congratulations from artisans who'd once viewed me only as an impartial authority. The wool community, it seemed, had room for this transformation. Near the main exhibition, Diana Wood stood with my mother, both women examining a display with critical eyes but friendly expressions. Another kind of healing, another kind of weaving. Looks like our families are figuring it out too, Daphne murmured. I squeezed her hand, feeling the silver ring press between our palms, a continuous thread connecting past to future, tradition to innovation, her life now irrevocably woven with mine.